this point, introduce you to either living or relatively recent philosophers that are the big ones.
Oh, I was gonna talk to you about my term project, because yeah, it's still not necessarily like one philosopher. I use a lot of the ideas from like some of the rudimentary, like Descartes, Kant, and like those. Is that okay? Because I know it said it was like more modern philosophers, but like, yeah, I'm using a lot of like.
Officially, Descartes is a modern philosopher.
Okay, cool.
Obviously not living, unless you interpret living in a way that's very broad, which, hey, we could do that too. Are you having fun with your research?
Yeah.
And you're actually writing words, so that you'll have 3,000 words.
I have about 2,000 down, 1,000 to go.
Nice.
That's good.
I've been trying to like force myself to sit down and at least crack out like a paragraph every day right after this class.
I think I write out a paragraph every 5 minutes, practically. Depends on what you're doing. I
Yeah,
suppose.
no, some days it'll be like, oh, I'm finding all this stuff. You know, like, next thing you know, I have like 5 pages, and then other days it's like, I'm struggling to even find like one piece of solid evidence that I want.
Well, that was real right. Like some, it's like 500,000 words like that, and then you're like, oh.
You can send me way more. I mean, I'm not suggesting that if you go over 3,000 words, then that's, no. I remember when I was in my ANOC course, which is the Advanced NCO, what the heck, ANOC, Advanced NCO course, I guess, in Fort Huachuca in Arizona. And I had, you know, they don't tell you your class standing, etc., but apparently I was number 1 of the class, which was like multiple groups, so that's kind of amazing. Although I'd done that before in other classes too, in the military. But in this particular case, it involved not just academics, but, you know, like being, you know, graded on your marching ability, you know, running a platoon, you know, marching them, you know, the desert, you know, recon, you know, all recon, you know, all kinds of things that aren't academic, you know.
You were a linguist, right?
Mm-hmm.
You still had to learn all that stuff?
Oh yeah, because everyone's a soldier.
Sure, okay. Yeah.
So you still have to do like all the, plus the leadership. Well, actually everyone in Fort Huachuca, that's a military intelligence school post. So everyone, you know, not all were linguists, but nonetheless everyone was in some aspect of intel. But it turned out I was the top of the class until like the very last event that we had to do. We had to give a presentation. I ended up doing mine on Indonesia. Informing the class about Indonesia, I had to have, you know, stuff to show them. And I had to talk for between 15 minutes and 17 minutes. And I was timed on it. And as I was getting close to, you know, I hit the 15 minutes and everyone was going like, okay, and I kept going because I still had like just a few more things to say, any questions. And I didn't stop. And so I ended up going to like 17 minutes, 5 seconds or something. And so I was a no-go. And so I missed that. And so I wasn't someone else ended up being the distinguished honor grad. But that actually worked out, I think, in my favor in the long run. You know, I can look back over things and everything seems to have just been perfect for everything to have worked out. Because if I had been the honor grad for that class, I may have made E8.
I don't know what that means.
You might still be in that.
And yes, and if that had been the case, I would have been obligated to stay rather than retire when I did.
Really?
Oh.
And then I wouldn't have, because I did make E7, but I came up on the almost list, way early. For EA. I mean, that's, you can get promoted earlier than the curve, and I did at each step. I mean, because of my college, because of, just, it's competing with everyone in your position across when there are roughly 2,000 linguists at the time. So you're competing with all of the ones in your category, at your seniority, etc. In any case, it worked out well because I did that well, but at the same time, I didn't do so well that I might have been promoted ahead of, and then I would have been obligated to, and probably would have, because of the advantage of everything. You'd be getting more money, but I would have been probably involved in the wars that occurred after that instead of retiring and coming up here and teaching all this time. So that's like, whoa, perfect. However, back when I was in college, a big part of my graduate experience was language analysis, philosophical language analysis, studying not only people like Ludwig Wittgenstein, and I did have a whole graduate seminar on Wittgenstein. So, and easy, you can easily cover material for a whole semester at a graduate level to cover Wittgenstein and all the issues that stuff brought up. But I also had philosophy of language, advanced logic, and the logic course and the philosophy of language course were taught by the same professor, Dr. Crotty, who was a fan of Willard Van Orman Quine and others. So it's not just Quine, but Quine was significant. Let me show you the old Wikipedia on Quine. Willard Van Orman. Give you an idea. It's interesting, they've got his passport picture
Yeah.
for the, so 1908, 2000. He died December 25th, Christmas Day, 2000. So, interesting. Akron, Ohio, is kind of like the seat of the industrial heart of the U.S. In any case, he goes Harvard for his graduate work. He graduated from, where I should say his I have his book, The Time of My Life. It's the boringest biography I've ever read. I mean, he could have, there it is, Oberlin. So he went to Oberlin, but then after graduating there, went to Harvard. By the way, as an undergraduate there, his roommate was B.F. Skinner. Are you familiar with B.F. Skinner?
No.
Behavioral psychology. And what's fun, there's a anecdote, not the kind of thing that you take if you've had some poison or something. You take
It's antidote.
the antidote. But the anecdote is that when he arrived there, he didn't know what his major should be, and Skinner didn't know what his major should be. And Skinner told him he should major in mathematical logic philosophy, and he told Skinner he should major in psychology. So in some sense, they're each, as roommates, responsible for what the other one's career took off to do. Kind of, just who knows if that's really the case. but he did great in college, went on for his PhD, and then following that was sent to Europe. And as part of that picture, he was recruiting various professors from different places in Europe who were Jewish, eventually going to be in trouble because of Hitler. That was the presumption. And what they were trying to do was persuade them to come and, at least for a time, teach at universities in the United States. Some of them didn't want to go because they didn't think there was going to be a problem there, and their careers and everything were set. And the United States, I guess, looked pretty outrageously foreign to a lot of them. Plus, they were all like Polish, Czech, so the language barrier would have been an issue for them too. But in any case, he's considered to have basically rescued at least a couple of the ones that would have probably been killed by the Holocaust. And in doing so, continued the mathematical, logical, like Tarski, for example. If you get into coding and computers and math, you'll see a lot of the people that he basically encouraged to come were significant. But also, while he was there, he was studying with them. So he comes back. Notice his thesis supervisor was Alfred North Whitehead, who you'll recall was the professor that inspired Russell, also Bertrand Russell. And remember that he was also the co-author with Russell of the Principia, which was the book that basically really got a lot of this language analysis going. He wasn't the only one. Frege's another, but clearly a significant portion of all of this. So that's interesting. Whitehead, by the way, is interesting in his own right. We really should look at him too. There's just so many people that are all interconnected in all of this. It's kind of amazing. By the way, there's another interesting thing about this, and I'm going to mention this. That, there's a book called The Sociology of Philosophies by Randall Collins. It was pretty interesting and has other stuff out there of the same sort. It's a huge book, bigger than this one. And what it is an analysis of all of the interconnections between philosophers in all of the different areas of the world, in all of the history of the world. So, and the beginning of it is sociological, an analysis of how we had these interaction rituals, the dance, so to speak, that we this is, you can analyze what's going on in class as kind of a ritual, that the teachers come and perform the way they do, or like last night at my drinking group, we all come and we shake hands, we sit around the table, we're all glad to see one another, we kind of have a breaking in kind of, where you're focusing on what's going on at the table, so you get your mind clear. Some jokes, and so I like my, the one friend, he's a retired psychiatrist, and I love pointing out to him, I've had you as my psychiatrist now for over 2 years, and I'm worse. He loves that. It's not like, it's hilarious. So we have a ritual. You might not think of it as a ritual because normally you think of rituals as like the ching ching, the mass or something. Do you take this ugly person, for your husband, or whatever, how that goes. This is a ritual, right? But we actually have, you can sociologically analyze interactions among peoples, that are certainly So we have a general theory of rituals, interaction rituals among intellectuals, etc. Right? And so, and then the structure of who knows who, and how this kind of passes along, which of course is going to be part of the picture that he describes here, right? So networks across the generations, etc. The structural crunch, by the way, is, yeah, you can only know so many people. You can only influence face-to-face so many people. Otherwise, you start forgetting people. Sorry about this. I guess it's been thousands of students that I've met. I don't remember the names of everyone. I was getting my mail yesterday on my street, and a young lady walked by with an infant in a backpack, a dog on a leash, and about 7 other kids, all, I don't know that they were all hers or who they were, but they're all walking at various, places with her down the street. And she yelled, she smiled and waved over and said, "Hi, Professor Jamison," which, wow, that's nice. And all I could think to say as a joke, "Gee, you need a few more kids, at least 2 or 3 more, because not enough, But she laughed. I don't remember who she is. I don't know where, but she remembered me somehow, and yet she's obviously quite busy. I don't know how she managed to remember me. But yeah, we have supposedly kind of a natural capacity for about 250 people.
Oh, really?
Does that make sense? I don't know where they come up with that, but
Yeah, well, once you meet so many people, it's like, I don't know, that's confusing though, because
And sometimes something could jog your memory to this
what if
one
you get
person.
really close to a whole bunch of people, somehow, all your attention? I don't know. It seems weird.
plus we tend to prefer people that have similarities.
Mm-hmm.
In a book group discussion about racism, I don't think I'm a racist. I have trouble with that, but I do think I'm a classist. I don't know how to describe the difference, but I feel like I like people who like similar things.
Right. Well, that's you can't help that. I mean, biologically.
I think it's I think it's natural. The advantage, though, is that the people can look and have all sorts of different characteristics themselves, but they like what I like, and so we have that. Like C.S. Lewis describes friendship as people that like the same things. So.
Right. Which is almost classist in itself, because of course people who are going to have the same interests of you are going to be the same people.
They could be. Although actually, I think it is. I keep looking at that because I'm worried that the batteries. I don't know how old the battery is, but it could change. You could have people who genetically are quite different, maybe even culturally are quite different, but have become interested in the same things that you have, and that actually becomes quite interesting because they're going to share different points of view on the same. So that broadens your horizons. That's a wonderful thing. On the other hand, even if the person looks like me, and in Alaska, a lot of ugly old guys look like me. It's that's the way that happens. It's kind of helpful if I wear nicer clothes than, because otherwise I look homeless. People will be concerned about me walking around. Remember, I worry about, people making comments on the crime site about this old ugly guy has been following me around in the store, and I'm like, was that me? Because I do that too. Not to follow somebody, but you could look like you're following somebody. However, the issue here is how many points of contact can be significant. So, like Socrates, if we look at Socrates, so Greece, intellectual law of small numbers, will I be able to go to that page? I guess not. Shoot. Maybe. Why it's not actually going. Nope, I guess not. But like he has images of well, so Socrates, then different kinds of lines to the people that influence Socrates, and different kinds of lines, like some like connecting lines mean he influenced this guy. And another person, dotted line or something, that means they were mad at him for something, right? So he influenced them in reverse or something, right? So it's kind of like a complex looking network of all these lines, connected lines, different types of lines, so that you can see who all these other philosophers were that we hardly ever discuss, but that nonetheless really, obviously the society was much more complex than just Socrates and Plato. There's other people, obviously, and you can see how they interconnected with one another. It's also interesting that we tend to take ideas on sides, so that there's like basically Plato is one side and Aristotle is the other, and then there's the in-betweens. So that all through our intellectual history from the Greeks on, we basically have these two major sides with everyone staking out a position somewhere in the middle, even today. So it's kind of an interesting way of kind of compartmentalizing what they're doing, who's influencing who, and yet even though the basic camps are the same, obviously there's progress made in the way it's understood.
Who would be the two sides today?
Well, we could still say Plato and Aristotle, in the sense that Plato's thinking in terms of formal systems is kind of more important, whereas Aristotle would think of things as empirically more important. Remember, if just last class I had the video, I think it was one of the ones I showed, where Isaiah Berlin was explaining to Brian McGee. Maybe that wasn't the one I showed, but it was one of the ones I watched, right? Where absolutely beautiful way of just dovetailing this into this kind of so, and by the way, he argues that philosophy is kind of in the middle, so if it's a formal system where we get knowledge from, 2 + 2 = 4, you don't get that from an empirical analysis of the world. That's the formal, system. In fact, a wonderful line was, he says, if you're playing chess and you say that the rule is that the king only moves one square, you wouldn't argue by saying, well, actually, the other day I was watching a game and the king moved 2 squares. 2 spaces. That's like, no. The rule, it's a rule. It's not what actually happens, when someone's, cheating or something. That's not chess. So that's a formal system. So you can know things about it because of the rules. Things have to follow the rules. So that's Plato, really. And on the other hand, you've got empirical analysis where, is everybody, that had pizza last night sick today? I remember once I was in the band in high school, and the band went to perform at a religious festival in New Jersey, and as reward for our service, basically the one family had us over for a big cookout, and the next morning we all woke up with the runs, and we found ourselves all late arrivals at high school, and we were all in line, and I remember Marty Knobloch, who was our drill, the guy with the big stick, whatever the heck, our band.
Conductor?
Not the conductor, because that was a
The
drill whatever he was. Well, yeah, he was also a flute player. But he was like laughing and says, "Oh, what do you have?" Because we all knew, So that's empirical. What's an empirical experience? And that's Aristotle, in a way. But Aristotle, remember, was wrong about a whole lot of things. So our empirical experience has grown. And we've obviously grown all sorts of formal systems. Plus, we understand the nature of formal systems, which in a sense is an empirical study of formal systems and how we create them. So there's clearly interrelationships between those. So this is kind of interesting. The book, however, goes all the way, it covers Oriental philosophies, Indian philosophies, European philosophies, all of the interconnections between people. Remember, this is a sociological study of philosophers. Ideas beget ideas, etc. It sounds an awful lot like Isaiah Berlin's. What's the connecting link between Berlin, Ignatieff, Taylor, and others like Fukuyama? Is the idea that, at a certain point, this Hegelian concept of the dialectical progress of spirit, culture, becomes a study in itself, a part of philosophy, an important part because it gives us an understanding of not only why things might have occurred the way they did, and we keep analyzing it and give us more and more insights, but also a real important goal of that, of course, is prediction. Will we go to war if Trump sends missiles into Syria, etc. All that stuff is kind of much more understandable in light of will we actually know what will happen? No, can't really predict. We know that because Marx was such a dismal failure at predicting what was going to happen. So we learn by experience that way too. But the book ends at the 1950s, and he explains that the reason it ends at the 1950s is because roughly around that time period, our interconnections became so much larger in number because of the media than had been in the case in the past, where you could literally know who was going to be influenced by Quine by the people who actually attended his classes and saw him face to face. So maybe 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 people might be influenced by a particular philosopher. We talk about various groupings in the United States, and including the folks that came from Europe at different times, and how they kind of influenced a certain network of individuals, which of course still has an impact on, are you a neocon? What does that mean? A neoconservative is not just in some sense that you were conservative in a new way, but that you're connected through Leo Strauss, through the school in Chicago, and through these specific students that then have an impact on, not just philosophy, but on politics, right? Because they influence presidents, right? Francis Fukuyama, by the way, came from that school, and he's, in one of his books, he was basically breaking ranks with the neocons because they were all heading towards war in Iraq to restructure the government there, top down, and he was arguing, no, you can't do it that way, it has to be bottom up, right? So, that's interesting that way. But roughly around the 1950s, we now had TV. So now you could go and actually see someone. So here's Brian McGee.
reject idealism, it must also mean that you reject dualism. I mean, I'm not
No place for the incursion of influences from outside the physical. Given all this, it would seem
So
that,
even though he died in
a
December
person's decisions
2000?
must themselves be
You do have his books.
activity on the part of a physical
In
object.
fact, a lot of them are on the internet.
A
A lot of other articles about him are on the internet. Or you can go to the library,
This
all of his
basic
books are there, right?
principle of the
Or
of
buy them.
physical science of the
Still
object.
available, of course.
Every change.
Buy them. Or if the internet works, you
Is-
could actually watch him
That there's no change without
through
the
this
change in the
problematic
distribution
virtual
of
reality
physical
of
properties over
the video,
space-time,
YouTube video.
over space. That alternative I find
I got to see him personally.
uncongenial because
He
the
was-
successes in natural science have been such that we
He was invited to speak at my alma mater while I was in graduate school there, and big! It was like, the Pope is coming. You know. Not really, of course, but I remember Phillips Memorial Hall, which is still there. It's kind of amazing. You know, you can still go and look at like Google Earth, and I could go in and I could see the hall. It's still furnished pretty much the same way as it was. It's almost medieval-like in its style and everything. And he is there, and he gave a speech. I remember the speech that he gave was about what his job was as a mathematical logician. And a lot of us were there taking advanced logic and interested in these kinds of possible futures. Right? I had no idea where I was going to go after there, of course. One of those people that took what I was interested in, not thinking, gee, what job will this prepare me for? You know, but in any case, so here he is, and he's explaining our job as mathematical logicians is to create a language that will enable the scientists to understand what they're doing and how they can communicate it with other people. And the problem, he explained, was that in physics, at the quantum level, there were no objects. You no longer have physical objects. And in English, the way our language works is you have nouns and predicates. Subjects and predicates, right? And the subjects, the nouns, are traditionally physical objects, like John Locke would explain, right? So you would have things made up of atoms and molecules, stuff. Then you have physical stuff that resists, change, etc., or promotes change depending on the kind of physical object it was, right? So you have physical objects, and then you describe the activities with the predicates that those objects have, right? Well, the problem is, in the quantum world, the so-called objects, and he explained why this was. So if we have particle A, particle B, and you have two boxes, two locations, right? If you have A and B in this box, A and B in this box, A in this box, B in this box, or B in this box and A in this box. That would be the traditional way we would talk about the placement of the objects. The trouble is A and B are the same. So you don't have A and B or B and A. You instead have one in each box, two in each box, in one box and not in the other, etc. Right? So quantitative differences rather than qualitative differences with regard to the objects, which means we can't use objects as the basis for the language anymore. Instead, what we have are variables, and that means that to be is to be a value to be the value of a bound variable.
Doesn't have quite the same ring to it, does it?
Oh, it's quite different. So, it's uncontroversial and in fact quite natural as it's compatible with modern approaches to the semantics of natural language. who says this, but yeah, that's, you might be surprised at this coming upon it all of a sudden, but guess what? If you're in logic or mathematics, etc., the ontology is mathematical now. And that's because everything is considered as sets of things. That's a European philosopher, Elaine Badiou. I don't know if I can find this. I have no clue if, ontology. No, I don't know what we're going to get out of any of this. But I've read that line in like his book, Logic of Worlds. So when we're trying to describe things today in our contemporary scientific sense, what we have are predicates describing the characteristics the things have. So you're not focusing on the things themselves, but variables. What has these characteristics, right? It is these characteristics. You can think, wow, that's a beautiful kind of climactic summation of the problems that Berkeley had and Hume had and Kant had in trying to describe what things are, because they were all confused thinking in terms of the things in themselves, and yet we perceive these characteristics. Well, today, they are their characteristics. That's almost Platonic, right? But in a way, it's kind of, again, a merging of the formal system plus the empirical system, because we are thinking that these things are empirically available to us through really amazing technologies. You know, we can actually test to see if there are certain kinds of particles existing. You wouldn't actually be able to see them yourself, but you splatter them against other particles at high rates of speed in a device, and you can then see the results that the computer gives you, and you feel like, wow, we've actually found the God particle. Woo, you know. What's the God particle? Well, it's what gives everything mass. Oh, okay, so that's holy? No, not that kind of mass. It's a different kind of mass, etc. Right? You know, so this is what Quine was teaching us in that particular lecture. But what made Quine famous, I don't know if I mentioned this already when we were talking about Kant and we were talking about analytic and synthetic distinction. Do you remember? Did I do that? Etc. So Quine was the one in 1952, I think, in his article, Two Dogmas of Empiricism. So 51. I was only 1 year off. It's pretty close. So Two Dogmas of Empiricism basically gives us a aspect of pragmatism. I'm trying to think if, you know, one of the test questions I had for this test was what's the difference between existentialism on one hand and Marxism on the other, and pragmatism, right? And if you try to think, well, the main difference seems to be existentialism defines the human being, whether you're thinking of it as Dasein, being there, or the en soi, or the in itself, or the an sich, you know, whatever you want to call the subjective side, right? The subjective side, right? You've got that, and it's free. It's a free agent. So you're not forced to be a certain kind of self by society, because you're a free agent. And especially if, like, you're an Ubermensch, right? You know the forces that society is trying to use to make you become a certain type of person, and you can resist them. And you say, oh, I'm not going to go that way. I'm my own self, right? You follow lots of other people coming into the building. For example, I heard, the one young lady sitting out in the back of her car on a phone conversation, talking with someone who I could also hear. I wasn't snooping, but I was just walking by, and he was talking about how, oh yeah, I've been smoking way too much, something, and I'm thinking it's weed, etc. And she said, oh, you're doing so much, etc. And, another young man walked by and said, oh, you can never do too much weed, etc. Or whatever the word is. It wasn't weed, but I got the impression they're using marijuana, right? And, I felt like the reason he said that wasn't perhaps because he actually believes that, but because he's trying to play a role that's expected of, because he's competing for attention. He wants to say the thing that would culturally appear to be, whoa, I'm one of you guys, I didn't interfere by saying anything like, well, there's no jobs for you, at least if they require clearance, that's, you're out. Most businesses in town point out, if you come up.
Technically, there has been studies done. It is basically impossible to overdose on marijuana.
I'm not saying
Yeah,
that
I mean,
that's the
so
case,
he's
but
kind of right. You can never do too much
Well,
because
from the medical perspective, but then if it's interfering with your daily life because you're not doing other
right.
things.
That's true. That's
right,
true. There's other
and plus
factors.
they have tests. And when I was in the military, you were not allowed to use those kinds of things, and there was a urinalysis that could be done that would know that you had some in your bloodstream for the last 3 months or so.
Right.
So we were told, and if you were, tested positive for that, you were basically fired. But it would be worse actually because you're breaking the law, so you would be punished actually.
Right. Now it's a little bit more lenient. Most places don't do like a.
I don't think the military has changed that though.
No. I just mean like most.
And a lot of companies that one of the first things, part of the
Interviews
and stuff requires you to stop by and drop off a sample of whatever. And guess what? If you're positive, they're not going to hire you.
Most places that do just like the standard cheek swab, they're actually just checking to see if you're high on the job, because most of that's like within the past like 36 hours in the mouth. So that's what I think most places are worried about nowadays. But I mean, the more intense like government jobs,
They are going to have to change it if all their applicants are using it.
Right.
That's true. On the other hand, there are reasons why they would rather their employees not be using stuff like that.
It's fascinating to me because I do urinalysis for a living, and out of all the drugs, most people are like, well, you got your cocaine, that's serious. Most people don't argue are socially acceptable, but those will only stay in your system 2-3 days for the test, but THC is like 45 days. So, we need a lot of people.
I lost a lot of friends in the military. I mean, you had to keep your top secret clearance, and you could be spot tested on a moment's notice. And guess what? If somebody used it, they were gone. And wow, no career, no financial security, in my mind, all the wonderful things that I've lucked out, it wasn't really just luck. I mean, I behaved myself, still do. Wednesday nights I have a couple glasses of wine, but guess what? I'm sure way under the limit, for driving safely home, etc. Although usually it does force me into the Barnes and Ignoble's bookstore at around 10:15, 10:30, because that's an open bathroom, and as an obligatory a result of my borrowing their facilities, I will probably buy a book, which means that my house is even more full.
Are they open that late?
They're open till 11.
What?
Nice.
Well, expensive.
It's like one of the latest stores around.
Well, I bought a large print edition of Ready Player One last night, because that's my book group's next read. I'm like sixth in line at for the one copy in the library and third for the other. So it doesn't look like I'm going to get those in time for me to read it in time. So I decided, and the ones on Amazon were expensive, plus would take a while to get. So I had to get right down. Plus it was my recommendation for the book group, so you got to read the one that you recommend. But so Two Dogmas of Pearson. How that must have been a squirrel. Got into drugs and stuff. I don't know how. But so Quine was absolutely impressive. Had a big impact. Pragmatism. That was how I got into it. You know, so in a sense, besides feeling the existentialist view that you're a free agent. That's true. You are a free agent. If society is trying to pressure you to vote for someone and you don't like them, you don't have to vote for them. You can decide you're going to ignore Facebook's Russian influences so that you're not going to be forced to vote for whatever. But the opponent one was Marxism that says the only reason you even think you have free agency is because society tells you, as an American, you're a free agent. You know, you're independent. If I'm I've got a full room, of actually attending folks instead of virtual folks, and I say, how many of you have free will? Everyone raises their hand. Exactly at the same time. So it seems pretty ironic, that we've all been trained to think of ourselves as free agents and independent individuals with rights, which, by the way, as Isaiah Berlin points out, those are beliefs held by Americans because we're inculcated in the religious documents of our society. All men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with individual right, human rights, the life, liberty, and the pursuit of pornography, or whatever gives you happiness, I suppose, right? That was a joke. It's not actually in the contract. Probably, a heresy to make fun of such an important religious document. So you get the idea. Marx, on the one hand, argues this. Kierkegaard, others, existentialists, Nietzsche, argue the other. American pragmatism kind of says, well, both are true. It is true that you're a free agent. It's also true that peer pressure. Both are true. Both are useful tools. Remember my old, going all the way back to the argument that, these are, as Stephen Hawking says before he died, in his book, The Great Design, co-authored with Mladenov, that we're using model-dependent realism. Right? We create these conceptual models that enables us to interpret our experience. They're useful, but don't forget that it's a model. There's other models, and all these different models, even though they theoretically look like they're in conflict with one another, could also be cooperative tools. You have to compartmentalize them in order to realize the usefulness of this tool. Don't worry about the mass of the earth while we're trying to figure out where such and such is, etc. Well, that applies to free agency. It's a concept that enables us to think about why people behave the way they do and what liberties you have to decide for yourself rather than be forced to do something. Or on the other hand, yes, we are influenced by peer pressure and the cultural Geist, the Weltgeist, the Zeitgeist, the spirit of the times, the Weltgeist, the spirit of kind of the world soul, right? Where we're moving towards, and so on. I ask questions about what's our obligation to Syria. What you're analyzing, what's going on, what your interpretation of cultural developments are. Do we have any ethical obligations to people in another world that are essentially, not another world, we wouldn't call it, but the situation there. And so all those things, that's part of the zeitgeist, the spirit of the times. I can imagine not so long ago we would have cared less about people in a foreign country like that. What does that have to do with us, right? So pragmatism merges both of those by accepting that there could be multiple kinds of conceptions, worldviews. So we got lots of different worldviews. The worldview of pragmatism says we should accept how these worldviews all interact with one another. Right? So when we look at how that meets the road, so to speak, how that theory meets the road, Quine gives us the web of belief, which is a book, but why want a PDF? No. Might be able to find this. So The Web of Belief is a book that Quine wrote with Joseph Ulian, and by the way, it's considered to be the only book that, apart from his biography, which, by the way, is the most boring biography I've ever read. This book is the book that people can read. All the other ones are really about analytic, mathematical logic, and you really need to be taking a logic course to understand the symbols, the issues involved, and so on. With this book, though, this is meant for English majors at Harvard, who Ulian wanted to be able to give them an idea of how pragmatism as a theory of knowledge works. And the concept of a web is what he uses. So you have this presentation, which there's several actually on the book, but if we talk about Descartes' architectural metaphor, we analyze that out in the book. But Quine uses the web metaphor. And so our most important beliefs, I keep checking this, our most important beliefs are like in this metaphor, they're the ones in here, right? Your core beliefs, right? But the border of the web is what touches reality, whatever we want to call that. I mean, what is reality, right? But in a sense, these are the empirical incoming influences. That everybody's sick this morning. Well, we must have eaten something wrong at the cookout. By the way, we found out that in order to keep everything from sticking to the grill, they put soap on the grill. Lesson learned, don't use soap on your grill because the soap will get on the meat and then you'll be eating soap, and you know what soap is supposed to do. It greases everything to come out of the clothes or off the hands. and through your system. So don't use soap on a grill just because it makes it nice and slick for the meat, right, to come off. That's the kind of experience that isn't going to go very, how to properly grill meat is not one of the most important core concepts in your psyche, But nonetheless, you could suddenly discover that all the kids who've gotten vaccinated against a particular flu or something ended up with autism. Whoa! People actually argue over this as an issue. By the way, that's just the opposite of the case as far as I've heard. But you can imagine these are people that are arguing over whether vaccinations are something that you could get for your children or not. That's going to influence your core belief. If your core belief is, protecting your children, and you feel like these doctors are giving the kids something that's going to cause harm to them, right? You're going to want to protect them. On the other hand, if you're convinced that vaccinations are going to keep them from experiencing harm, more so than the possibility of them experiencing harm from it, then you're going to find your web changed or not, depending on a core belief in trust of, say, medical science, medical professionals, etc. That's certainly an issue. So it's like world of experience, web attachments, observation sentences. What do you see? So observation sentences are what you actually see, right? And then you make a sentence. So in the first case, a man with a hat putting a white envelope in a mailbox. Second, dean of the law school mailing a birthday check to his daughter in Belgium. Well, this is an observation sentence so far as you know. This is not, because you don't know any of that stuff. So you have to have other reasons for believing that that's more detailed. So all competent language users who witness the event will not. So I've mentioned this a couple times. If I say this is a cup, that's an observation sentence. If I say it's a good one, then we can end up interpreting. And that means that the second is not an observation sentence, right? So pragmatism is concerned about good science, and good science requires us to understand what could be considered true and false, and what is not possible for us to lump as true or false because of the interpretation that's involved in our understanding what we're thinking, right? So in other words, we have to be aware of where our interpretations can mislead us. That's one of the reasons why I keep thinking about all this stuff about Trump lying and everything. Awful lot of intelligent people that I know keep complaining about Trump lying, and when I think about what he says and what their complaint is, realize that he's not giving us observation sentences. They're neither true nor false. They're his interpretations. He cannot be lying about a statement that he's making that's an interpretation. Strictly speaking, that's our own scientific analysis of whether people's telling the truth or not. Those are not capable of being lies, just on the nature of the way speech works. And so all these intelligent folks that are complaining about their president that's lying don't understand that those are differences of opinion that they're having with him. And they're voicing their frustration with him because his difference of opinion is so different. But that doesn't mean that he's lying and therefore, being illegal or something. They're just upset because his worldview is so different in so many respects than theirs. That doesn't make him a liar. UFO, there's a UFO, non-observation sentences. Is this interesting? See how this presentation is going through the web of belief as a book. By the way, it's on the web. It shouldn't be because it's copyright still, but believe it or not, it's there. talks about observations, inferred beliefs, deep-seated beliefs. What are they? They're far removed from direct experience, but they're what structure how you perceive that experience. It's basically your operating system, if you think of it as your computer, so they play a central role in your thinking, for example. We have conversion experiences, etc. How does this look using the web? We have deep-seated beliefs in there, but if we have remember, this is the hedgehog and the fox. That's kind of intriguing. There's one big thing. What is belief? That's another point that you make. By the way, this book is from the 70s, 79, I think. What is a belief? It's not a feeling, not an activity, it's disposition. Remember, this is a psychological theory of knowledge. Pragmatism, remember James was a psychologist, right? So when we're thinking about our dispositions, what makes us think something is true, it's a psychological characteristic, right? Warning, etc. How do we form or change our beliefs? By observation, inference. Which beliefs fit together? Are they coherent? That's another thing I've seen a lot of folks say, like Democrats on the one hand, how can you believe this and this? To them, that's incoherent. But from the world view of the person that believes both of those, they're perfectly coherent. They're not conflicts. You should kill, capital punish. You should use capital punishment on murderers, right? On the other hand, you should never abort a fetus. Right? That seems like a contradiction to someone who feels that if you're respecting life, you should respect both. On the other hand, if you're a conservative, no, those are not in conflict at all. They perfectly go together with my beliefs, right? Does that make sense? So he does a detective story as an example of how to do this, etc. You're welcome to look. Obviously, we're on specific pages on the book. It's a short book. I think it's only about 90 pages. But I think this is about where this presentation ends. What's the easiest way to finish it now? I'm kind of stuck in it. There. So, but there's other ones that you could use to look how it goes through the book, The Virtues, for example, of, what's it called? I'm getting a blank here. Virtues of, virtues of making a good conclusion, basically. Don't make conclusions that are just totally out there and not based on your experience. Don't make them so specific that they're not general enough to be useful. So that there's all these different virtues. Just basically good ideas about being. So, Quine, pretty interesting, pragmatist. Theory of knowledge then is also part of the difference between existentialism and Marxism. It ties in beautifully with Dewey's approach to education, that if we're going to educate people how to solve problems, they have to be able to do this kind of theory of inquiry to come to a conclusion about it. So that's part of pragmatism. That is different from an existentialist point of view or a Marxist point of view. In fact, I'm not sure really how either of those European schools tie into theory of knowledge very well, whereas pragmatism certainly does. I was going to talk about John Rawls a little bit, and Alistair McIntyre. Alistair McIntyre. So it's kind of odd. He's born in Scotland, and yet a lot of pages refer to him as an American philosopher. Well, he's done most of his time teaching in a long career in the United States, so I suppose in that sense you could refer to him as an American philosopher, but actually he still has a Scottish accent. So he's 89 right now, and he's primarily important in ethics. He is a Catholic, and his influence is primarily in his books, After Virtue, other books on moral philosophy, After Virtue, Whose Justice, Which Rationality. Remember in the kind of analysis of thought as kind of a history of thought or a history of ideas that we get from Isaiah Berlin and others, we've got here, whose justice? Well, if you analyze justice, the concept, and rationality, the concept, through European history of thought, what you end up realizing is that there are multiple versions of that, and they have different impacts on what decisions we make over things. And so the idea that we should encourage justice, well, you could actually be arguing with someone else who also wants to encourage justice. The problem is you've got different conceptions of what's just. So we should look at this kind of a history to figure out, well, where does this conception begin? Where does this one begin? Why are they in conflict, etc., right? You know, an interesting book about the United States is that there's like really different Americans, Americas, or different nations, American nations. I don't know if I mentioned this one, but so in this particular book, he's saying what, 11. So he's breaking the United States up into like 11 different cultural groups. I'm sure that's still arguable, right? What makes different, and you could actually map it out and see where they are. You see how that affects voting, and it affects their beliefs in different kinds of justice. What's important, what your values are. Oh my goodness, absolutely fascinating. A part of the truth, clearly. Good data, as long as he's giving us good data, you follow the movements of people, as they immigrated into the United States from different places, and as they progressed and moved to different places, say the Norwegians, where they ended up, and the Scots, where they ended up, and so on. You've got these different pockets of the population that are still carriers of these various ethnic belief systems that then persist. They get changed, obviously, because the different generations end up merging with kind of the melting pot. And of course, technology changes. Whoa, think about how that impacts things. Whoa. I'm watching Zuckerberg being interviewed by the senators. He's in the hot seat. I don't know if he's there again today, but they're asking him questions. I should show them. I don't know if you've had a chance to look at this, but the senators ask him a question, and you look at his face, and he's puzzled because he realizes they have no clue how any of this stuff works. Their question is misleading. It doesn't fit the issues at all, and yet he's got to be polite. These are senators. He's trying to be friendly, and he can't look at them and say, that's a stupid question. You know, he has to act as if that's a serious question, and yet his answers then, I really should show you some of the, just be a waste of your time.
There's a whole bunch of memes on the internet because apparently he was sitting in a booster seat, like to make him taller for this interview.
Oh no. Oh no. Where's the video?
User agreement. Here's what everybody's been trying to tell you today, and I say this gently.
This is gently.
Your user agreement sucks. You can spot me 75 IQ points. If I can figure it out, you can figure it out. The purpose of that user agreement is to cover Facebook's rear end. It's not to inform your users about their rights. Now, you know that, and I know that. I'm going to suggest to you that you go back home and rewrite it. And tell your $1,200 an hour lawyers, no disrespect, they're good.
What?
It's hilarious. The whole thing is hilarious.
He looks so done. Like he's not even gonna like try to debate it. He just is like.
He's been pretty open-minded with
Oh,
the whole thing.
yeah.
actually.
I mean, I can understand where they're coming from, and I can understand where he's coming from. So I'm working with at least an awareness, basically, of two worldviews that are in a clash here. They clearly have goals out of all of this. Zuckerberg, on the other hand, I'm sure has his goals of keeping Facebook not only out of legal trouble, but also keeping its value high for stakeholders and so on. Plus, he's answering the questions thinking in terms of his audience, his Facebook audience, are not just United States citizens, but they're world citizens, and they're wanting to impose U.S. regulations on them, and he's aware that, you know, that's really actually inappropriate. Because they're not just United States citizens. In fact, Europe is trying to impose stricter regulations on Facebook's privacy requirements than the United States, right? They're actually forcing an issue, which is something he mentions that actually within, I think, the end of May, Facebook's going to have to react to the requirements that Europe imposes, which will be stricter than what they're talking about here. So a lot of what they're wanting him to do for the United States is actually already going to happen for Europe.
I don't know any user agreement a company puts out that isn't to protect the company
Oh,
that internet.
oh.
So
And as Eddie Izzard points out, we lie every time we click.
yeah.
I've read it, because none of us have read the user agreement.
I'm pretty sure Google is not any less private than.
He's got the, you know, the one kid says, "But Dad, you've lied." He's like, "You've clicked the user agreement, saying that you read and you're like, oh crap." And yes, no, I mean, you'd still be reading it, you know. But clearly, they're asking questions that are just dumb. Clearly, some of them haven't even used. I've got to quit. I'll ask you that quiz question. Do you think Facebook's privacy requirements. No, that's not the right word.
Policy?
Should Facebook do more to protect the user's privacy? Is that good? You can actually respond to that in other ways, because to some extent, as he points out, what Facebook knows is totally a result of your willingness to share. So actually, you're really in charge of your privacy.
We're the product.
That's an interesting, way of looking at it. I mean, I obviously love Facebook. If
Yes,
you think about it.
I enjoy it too, but in the end, that's how they're making their money, is off the
Oh,
information you
sure.
put in there.
Sure.
And that's why it's free.
They're, like the one senator was saying, well, you guys have connected, everything that they've done, and it's like, no, Facebook doesn't do that. She's confusing the internet with Facebook, and it's not. So like if I'm searching for something on Google, Google's keeping that information of what I'm searching for, but I don't search for anything on Facebook except like a friend or something. I don't go and look for pornography or something on Facebook. Actually, I don't look for pornography on Google either, unless it's at least old enough to be considered art. In which case, maybe, I used to teach Humanities 1 and Humanities 2, and part of what we would cover would be like a history of art, because that was a course for people that had never had any art courses. And they needed to, those needed to be covered in that course. So, various paintings, that, are basically Renaissance nudes, I was in a museum. This is an interesting, let's not go there. I could talk about this kind of stuff for days. You guys have other schedule things to do. Well, have a good weekend.
Thank you, you too. It's
Can I hang out here for
beautiful.
like 20, 30 more minutes real quick?
You're welcome. The other class is supposed to be here at 2:30, although they've been moving more and more towards the virtual side.